I'm really, really happy to introduce a friend, Tila Mazel, who is a wonderful researcher and professor and writer. And Tila has a number of books, but the book she will be talking about has the absolute direct connection with our topic. That is Janusz Korczak. And after I heard Tila and I read the book, and then she spoke at our Korczak conference last year, I thought it would be absolutely so sad not to have her here. And she agreed to come. So, right from the ferry boat to you, please.
Oh, thank you so much. So, let's see. Everybody can hear me fine? Yes? So I wonder if I could just go around and really, really quickly ask everybody how you ended up here and what your connection to the Korczak Summer Institute is, just because that will help me tell you which parts of the story might be most relevant to you.
You can give them the microphone.
Sure.
Then,
So we'll pass that right around. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Anita Van Ries. I'm a teacher for the Francophone School Board. It's a school board that goes all over the province, but my school is in Vancouver. I'm very interested by the whole pedagogy and also the whole Holocaust story. Actually, my father was in the Second World War. He was a soldier in the French army, and last year I took a course with Facing History on Genocide, and this year I saw advertised the legacy of Korczak, and I was very interested because I had no idea who he was. It was completely new for me, so I really wanted to learn more about it. Thank you.
I'm Judith. My background is from computers, business and engineering. But my interest in this course was Janusz Korczak, Poland, and the Holocaust, and children development maybe.
Okay, great, thank you.
I am Miss Alice. I'm a daycare teacher, and also I'm also a master's student at UBC. My major is early childhood education, and I'm here to learn more about children's advocacy. I have to admit that before this course, I don't know anything about Janusz Korczak, but I learned so much amazing that he did. Great.
Perfect, thank you.
Hi, my name is Clea Bland. I'm a family nurse practitioner for an outreach social pediatrics program in the downtown east side called the Richer Initiative. I work out of BC Children's Hospital, but we're totally outreach in schools, daycares, community centers, and we have a clinic in a social housing complex in the downtown east side community. Our mission is to create access to healthcare services for disadvantaged children and their families. And I'm here in particular because I'm working on a project called Circle of the Child that aims to put the rights of the child in the center as we build a network of support to be able to meet that child's needs in a healthy way.
Great, that sounds like great work. Godspeed.
Hi, my name is Siegfried. I'm a secondary school teacher, also a master's student here in Human Development, Learning, and Culture. And I'm here because my supervisors recommended the course to take.
Good, great, that's wonderful.
I hope you won't kill her out.
My name is Jane Kamen. I'm here mainly because my grandparents were Isaac and Stella Leesberg, who were friends and colleagues of Janusz Korczak. So, and actually, my aunt Irene was married to Stash Wilczynski, who was the younger brother of Pani Stefa. So I didn't know an enormous amount of detail about the writings, but I've grown up knowing him and the stories my entire life.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And Bronwyn.
Oh, right there, Bronwyn. Sorry.
Okay. I'm Bronwyn. I'm manager of advocacy with the Representative for Children and Youth. So when my work started around children's rights 10 years ago, I heard of Janusz Korczak. but read a book last year about him and just wanted to know more.
Okay, great, perfect. And then I know Karen is your next
Yeah,
speaker,
I
so
will.
we'll hold off on
I will
introducing Karen
introduce
until, and Jerry.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Everyone knows Jerry.
everyone knows Jerry. Who doesn't know Jerry? So what I thought I would do then, and that's very helpful information. So what I'll do then is, I've got about 45 minutes, and then I'm happy to take some questions as well. I'm going to talk to you a little bit first about how it is that I got involved myself. I'll reciprocate the favor and give you a little bit of information about how I came to this story and my background. And then I'll focus the story on four people. I mean, I know you've learned a lot about Korczak. So I'm going to focus mostly on the story of Irena and how she connects to Korczak's story. The story of a woman who was, and this is a nod to Clea here, was a nurse, the chief nurse in the Warsaw Ghetto, who was a very good friend of hers and a collaborator, whose story is also a very important part of both Korczak's story and Irena's story. And then a little bit on the story of Stefa, who sometimes gets overshadowed, I think, by the just the real sort of moral courage and charisma of Korczak. And her story is the other half of that partnership, but she was sometimes the more silent partner because she was not the public face of the partnership for many people. So my background is I started out as an English professor and as a historian. I mostly focus on Second World War history. Actually, my focus is primarily historically on the Second World War in France. So I began as a specialist of the Vichy period, working on what I call hidden histories, right? Thinking about the ways in which certain kinds of stories tend not to be told. And of course, if you know France in the Vichy period, you know that the research is extremely difficult and that all cultures have the topics that they struggle to speak of. And for the French, the Vichy period really is still that moment, right? It's a very, very difficult cultural topic for the French. So I began really focusing on that, on stories about things like the history of resistance networks led by employees working at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, which was occupied by the Germans as well as Paris. Or women's biography more generally. I'm interested in that as a topic, thinking about the ways in which historically, just with the history of patriarchy, women's lives have tended to be less public, in some ways thinking ahead to Stefa, right, and to that story of how women's lives tend to be domestic and therefore kind of secret. So the way that my particular interest in this story began, I don't come from the Jewish community, don't have connections to the Jewish community. Really, it's my family's connection to Poland, and we are also not Polish. But so you're making the story less transparent for you by the minute, right? So my brother and sister-in-law used to work for the U.S. State Department. I'm a U.S. And Canadian binational, and so they worked in Poland. They were sent to work at the consulate. My brother was the visa office in Krakow. My sister-in-law ran the American school in Krakow. And they went to Poland as diplomats and fell in love with Poland. I had gone over when my niece and nephew were first born to see the new babies. And that was in the period right after Irena Sendler had just died, and which would have been in 2007. And her story was already pretty well known at that moment in Poland. She had, at the end of her life, become pretty well known in the country, although certain parts of that story are still to be told, I would say. Even having written the biography of Irena Sendler, I would say that the period after the Second World War is a story that someday somebody will need to write, but at this moment those Cold War archives are not accessible or reliable enough to tell that story. So it was really when I was there in Poland on that occasion that my sister-in-law said to me, hey, she knew I was looking for a new book topic. She knew that I work on hidden histories, especially women's lives. She said, have you heard this story about this woman named Irena Sendler? And I had not ever heard it. And so she told me the story, and I thought, that's an amazing and important story of literally a hidden network, right? Because this was a resistance network, it had to stay hidden, because if it had been exposed, that would have risked both Irena and her collaborators and the children and the families involved. So that was really how I came to that story, is from that kind of academic background and interest in women's biography. And so what I discovered, I'll give you a quick just overview of what Irena Sendler's story is. Have any of you heard the story of Irena Sendler before? So there is a documentary, Mary Skinner. Yeah, I talked to her. And then there's a Hallmark. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That one's a little bit less reliable. Mary Skinner's documentary is very, very reliable. The Life in a Jar is another book you may have come across. That is, I think of that more as a kind of memoir of the school children involved, and did really important work early on in helping to popularize Irena's story, but I think the subsequent research has gone beyond that book at this point. So for those of you who haven't heard anything about Irena Sendler, the story is in the 1930s, Warsaw, right? Poland in the 1930s was an incredibly vibrant and really very progressive society. It was the moment where what we now think of as the modern welfare state in the kind of Canadian and European context was really being developed. It was being developed by a series of academics and practitioners, both pediatricians, nurses, lawyers, children's advocates of different kinds, and also people within the pedagogy departments, especially at the Polish Free University, but to some lesser extent at the University of Warsaw. And they were working together to try to solve problems of unemployment, child poverty, access to education. One of those professors was a very, very important woman named Helena Radlinska, who came from the Jewish community but really didn't really think of herself as Jewish, right? I mean, she had a Jewish family background but was not religious. One of those professors was Janusz Korczak, who of course you know about. And another one of the practitioners involved was Irena Sendler's father, who was a doctor and who was very involved in working especially with impoverished communities to make sure that there was access to health care. And very few doctors were willing to work with the Jewish community. He was one of those exceptions. So Irena Sendler, as a young girl in the 20s then, grows up with a father who is deeply committed to social advocacy and to social work, and has this really as a model before her. He ends up dying when she's a young child, largely as a result of exposure to epidemics. They think probably cholera or typhoid is what he died of. And at that moment, her mother is now a single mother and is quite financially strapped. At that moment, the Jewish community comes to her mother and offers to pay for Irena's education in recognition of her father's advocacy and support for the Jewish community. Her mother's a very proud woman and says, no thank you, I'll take care of my daughter myself. But Irena and her mother never forgot, right, that kind of tie between the Jewish community and her family. It also meant that Irena grew up very familiar with Jewish culture. And one of the things that really is important about that is that what all the evidence shows is that the people who helped in the Holocaust, the Poles who did help in the Holocaust, or the people in France who helped in the Holocaust, almost 2-1 were people who had some personal connection with some individual person from that community, right? So, one of the things that the research suggests is that why, as educators, we would want to have children in very diverse classrooms is that the things that prevent things like genocide are simply knowing people from the other community as an individual person. And so for Irena, she fits into that, very much into that demographic. So she grows up and she goes to the university. She decides that she wants to be an attorney and work in public advocacy. It's not a period in time, despite the kind of progressive nature of Poland in many other ways in the 1930s, where that's a real possibility for women. She's discouraged by the faculty from doing that. So she instead goes and becomes a teacher. She trains to become a teacher. She marries at this point a young Polish man named Mitek Sendler. That's the moment where she becomes Irena Sendler. When she graduates, 2 things have happened. One is that she's fallen in love with a young Jewish man who unfortunately is also married. His wife was a friend in one of her classes. So there's 2 very young couples. Neither of them have marriages that are working out. and Adam and Irena fall in love with each other, and she decides to go on and do graduate work. And at that moment, she does graduate work, moves over to the Polish Free University, and becomes a student of Helena Redlinska's, where Janusz Korczak is also one of the teachers on the faculty. So this is kind of the beginning of that kind of connection, but of course when she goes there, her father is already known to all of these people, right? I mean, for her, this is more of a homecoming in a certain way than it is a kind of new beginning in that context. So she goes on to work with Helena Redlinska as a student, and she meets a group of women who become very, very important in the story that follows of what they do together in the Warsaw Ghetto. So you have to remember that by the 1930s, anti-Semitism is already not only significant in Poland, but is already being quite firmly legislated, right? I mean, there is something known as the bench ghetto, which is instituted in the 30s. One of Irena Sendler's first involvements as a social activist is in that context, where what the decree was is that Jewish students had to sit on a separate side of the auditorium in a university from what was called the Aryan students, right? So there was a ghetto of the seats, literally, in university settings. So she was very involved in the protests against that on campuses in that period. Got quite badly beaten up at one of them, quite famously. So she goes and she works then and meets these different friends. One of the friends is Alla Grinbergova, and Alla is a little bit older than she is. Alla is very, very tightly connected with Janusz Korczak already. So Korczak, because Alla is a bit older, and because she was understood as a nurse to be very, very talented with children, was somebody that Korczak was very drawn to. When he was doing radio programs, he would often put Alla on the radio as one of the experts in child pedagogy from the nurse's perspective, right? So she has kind of, because of those radio programs before the German occupation, she has this kind of aura among the other students and is known in a kind of semi-public way. And all of the other girls look up to her as what, really who they want to become. And Irena and Alla in particular become very, very good friends. But there are also a series of other women. One of them is a girl named Rachela Rosenthal. There's another one, another friend named Ava. Group of maybe a half dozen women, all of whom, Sophia is another one. There's a group of maybe a half dozen women who are very, very close friends and are all Dr. Redlinska's students. So what happens, of course, is that the World War II begins. Ultimately, Poland falls and is occupied by the Germans. When the German occupation begins, the first law, the Resistance Act really begins as simply a kind of defiance of the Germans, right? It doesn't begin as an organized program. But the important thing is that you've got this group of women, all of whom are friends, long historical and in some cases family ties, who have been trained already as graduate students to have practice in social organization, right? Social and community organizing is the thing that they know how to do. And they have very, very similar values and philosophies about social justice. And so before the ghetto was instituted, when the Germans occupied, the first rule is simply that Irena at this point is working in a social welfare office. And the rule is that Jewish people are no longer allowed to receive social welfare. And so Irena and her friends in the office decide that they are simply going to defy the German regulation. They're going to make sure that all of their clients get access to social welfare services. And so it really begins just as office welfare fraud is what they do, is they begin fiddling the files. So the Germans say that no Jewish person can receive aid. So they end up making up fake names for their clients that are sometimes hysterically and stereotypically Polish, apparently. They make up these family profiles. And then they assign to these families highly communicable diseases that will prevent the Germans from wanting to follow up on home visits to find out, because the Germans were very afraid that they would catch typhoid or cholera, all of which they were allowing to run rampant in Poland as part of a kind of deliberate, it was really meant to be a deliberate public health crisis that they were trying to create. but they didn't want to catch their own public health crisis. So this was very effective at deterring people from checking up on these clients. And it really begins then for them as this act of political and patriotic resistance, right? That's how they end of a commitment to social justice. Well then, of course, what happens next is that the ghetto is instituted. Now you have to sort of imagine Irena Sendler's position. She's a woman in her late 20s. She has a Jewish boyfriend who she's been with for a number of years that she's very much in love with. He's in the ghetto. All of her girlfriends are now in the ghetto, and her boyfriend's wife is in the ghetto, right? And she very quickly decides that she's going to figure out how she's going to get into the ghetto to see her friends and her boyfriend. So she reaches out to a doctor who is already engaged in acts of resistance, who's connected with both Redlinska and with Korczak and who knew her father. And that doctor ends up giving her an epidemic control pass. And it basically says that she's one of the people who the Germans have allowed to go in to monitor the progress of the diseases in the ghetto and to report on those statistics. So she's now got a pass and she's allowed in and out of the ghetto on a daily basis. And so she does. She goes and she visits her friends, she visits Adam, and very quickly she witnesses what's happening in the ghetto, which is really a deliberate program of deprivation and starvation, right? Hoping that starvation and disease will solve a problem for the Germans that they haven't yet come up with a final solution for, as it were. And so she goes and she witnesses, and she's one of the few people, right, who really is witnessing this on a daily basis. And it begins with simply seeing that there are no vaccinations. So it starts out that she starts smuggling vaccinations into the ghetto and is smuggling also money into the ghetto so that on the black market people can buy food. And her girlfriends very quickly organize themselves into an organization within the ghetto to help especially children and especially orphaned children. Because the most vulnerable populations inside the ghetto were not the Jews from Warsaw, right? I mean, although the conditions for those families were terrible, they at least had come from Warsaw with some kinds of resources available to them locally, and they typically had extended family networks because their families were from that area. But you have to remember that there were people who were Jewish families who were being sent from other areas where they were being displaced and asked to move into the Warsaw ghetto, where space was already cramped and they had no connections, and they often arrived ill from having had to travel in difficult conditions for a long period, so that those adults tended to die at just a really terrifying rate early on, leaving orphaned children who had no family to care for them. And so the Redlinska's girls, basically, they set up this network to try to help those children. And many of those children are teenagers, right? Some of them are little children, but a lot of them are teenagers. And so a lot of the network becomes groups of 12, 13, 14-year-old children who are really helping littler children as part of what that organization is. They, of course, are immediately connected with Korczak, right, who is running the orphanage with Stefa in the ghetto. So they're working closely with Korczak, and also the files at the IPN, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Museum in Warsaw. What those files suggest is that Helena Redlinska, although she escapes the ghetto and is in hiding outside the ghetto, what those files suggest is that Helena Redlinska, who is hiding in one of the convents, is actually also running and organizing networks of cells, right? So we found the evidence that says that Irena Sendler was working in one of Helena Redlinska's cells. And we know that a number of other of the women who were involved with Irena kind of tangentially were part of these cells that were set up by Helena Redlinska to assist the children in the ghetto, right, and the Jewish community generally. And so the way it would work is Redlinska would reach out to one of her former students. We know that Irena at one point goes and visits Helena Redlinska in the convent. And we know that at that moment, I mean, essentially Redlinska is encouraging her students independently to set up resistance, ways to resist, right, and community activism. And we know that these people didn't typically know what the other person was doing, right? So that Irena would run into 4 other former students of Redlinska's, and we know, for example, that her friend and colleague Sofia probably never told Irena that she was also running a separate cell, right? I mean, sometimes they figured it out as things went along during the war, but in the beginning, the idea was not to let them know, because if you got arrested by the Gestapo, you couldn't tell what you didn't know, right? So Irena is at this point pulled in as well as a cell. So it begins then bringing things into the ghetto, attempting to smuggle supplies in. At this point, Alla is now the chief nurse in the ghetto, and is, one of the very, very important political figures and public health figures. And ultimately what happens as the conditions deteriorate further, Irena says, she tries to persuade her friends and Adam to flee and to go into hiding. And they refuse by and large. They say, we can't leave our community and our responsibilities. And so she says, the problem was that to go and visit her friends every day, they reached a point where you had to walk over the bodies of kids starving on the street. And she says that the first time they took a child out of the ghetto, it was just a spur of the moment decision, right? That there's a kid, she's on her way out of the ghetto, she took the kid with her. And she said that was when she realized that it could be done. And so by the time you're into 1942, there's a decision, 41 even, decision to begin actively taking, at first it's street children, right? It's orphaned children out of the ghetto. So they're not taking children who have family care. These are the children who don't have any family or parents, who are living only in the orphanages, or only primarily really in the organization known as Centos, which has another care organization. Began trying to get these children out of the ghetto and place them in either foster homes or in Catholic orphanages. And so they would begin smuggling those children out through quite elaborate and often quite controversial means. So in some cases, if a child could act well enough and were able to be courageous enough, you could teach a child to speak Polish, you could teach a child catechism, and the child could walk into one of the churches that had an entrance on the ghetto side and could pass the German test by reciting them, answering the right questions and reciting the catechism, and could walk out into onto what was then known as the Aryan side. So in some cases, that was one. In the case of one of the Holocaust survivors that I'd interviewed for the book, named Beata Fikowska, in Beata's case, she was a 6-month-old baby, and they put her in a toolbox and they drugged her to go to sleep so she wouldn't cry, put her in the back of a truck underneath a pile of bricks, and drove her across the ghetto, out of the, past the checkpoint. In other cases, children went out through sewers. The sewer systems underneath the city, very often young teenage girls were the ones leading people through the sewers to escape. Another case was a boy who escaped by putting his shoes behind a man's boots, who had 2 big boots, and underneath his coat, and they walked across the checkpoint that way. So all of these ways of trying to smuggle children out of the ghetto and then place them either in foster homes or in orphanages, or in some cases in hiding, right? I mean, it was very, very difficult. One of the things that you'll notice is that the children who were saved were almost always under the age of 7 or 8. It was extremely difficult to save a child over the age of 7 or 8 because that's the age at which the native language acquisition begins to shut down, right? So many of the children, especially in the Orthodox community, did not speak Polish, and so had to be taught Polish without an accent. And unless a child could be taught to speak the language without an accent, the moment they spoke, it was a giveaway. It was also very difficult to save little Jewish boys. Most of the children saved happened to be girls, and that was because the boys were circumcised, right? And it was a very easy test for German soldiers to perform. So there were cases of the women in Irena's network running beauty salons. I met a man named Andreas Marianowski, and he remembers his mother, who was one of Irena's friends and collaborators. His mother was the woman who ran the beauty salon, the beauty salon was a place you took children, and if they were little Jewish boys, they were converted into little Catholic girls, right? And they would spend their time in the war basically disguising their gender. His mom was also the one who dyed the children's hair to turn brown hair blonde, right? So that these children could try to hide in sight was other part of it. So they begin getting the children out. One of the more famous stories, I mean, you probably know the story of Janusz Korczak and his walk to Treblinka. I imagine you've already heard that story. Irena was one of the people who witnessed that march through the ghetto that day. She was in the ghetto and was one of the people who saw that. And for her, there was a story behind that story that made that, she said to the end of her life that was the worst thing that she ever witnessed, right? She said at that moment, I don't know how our hearts didn't break. But for her, what had happened is that those children had already been children that Irena and her friends had helped to save once, right? So what had happened was that the other thing that their network was doing is that the Germans at one point would order roundups of street children who were living on the so-called, and again, forgive me, the Aryan side of Warsaw. One day they had a roundup and they rounded up 33 children. Well, they rounded up more children than that, 33 of whom were identified as Jewish children or probable Jewish children. And at that moment, luckily the German officer involved gave Jan Drobiczynski a choice, and he said, you have until midnight tonight to make these Jewish children disappear. If you don't make these Jewish children disappear, then I will report it and take care of it. And he knew exactly, that was not going to end well for the children. And so at that moment, there was one occasion where for those 33 children, they organized an operation to smuggle those children back into the Warsaw Ghetto. The person that Jan Drobiczynski called and asked to help him at that moment was Janusz Korczak and Stefa. And they said, of course, that they would help smuggle the children back into the Warsaw Ghetto and then would take them at the orphanage. And so they prepared the children, and Jan Drobiczynski remembers the moment. He says, he remembered the moment where they took the children to a hole in the ghetto wall that night. There were always ghetto holes in the wall opening up and closing. Took the children to a hole in the ghetto wall, and he says it was only in the moment that he heard children's voices on the other side of the wall that he understood that Korczak and Stefa had sent other children to help to smuggle the children back through. So that, true to the principles really of Stefa and Korczak, it was a children's operation to come and save fellow children. So those children made it safely back into the ghetto, but they were children that, Irena and her friends had helped wash, right? They'd given them showers and they'd given them clothing. And Irena then began also smuggling into the ghetto at that point dolls. Right, and they were dolls that were made by another professor at the Polish Free University who was living in hiding, and he spent the war making dolls with Semitic features because he wanted the children to have dolls that looked like their family. And so one of the things that Irena also risked her life to smuggle back into the ghetto were these dolls that they gave to the 30 children. And of course, the problem for Irena was that not only that day when the children made their walk with Stefa and Janusz to Treblinka, to the Umschlagplatz, the thing that when those children were allowed to choose the belonging that they wanted to carry with them, the children chose those dolls. So she says she remembers standing there, right, watching what she thought of already as her kids, walking to what she understood the Umschlagplatz to be, because by then, by the time of the actions, right, already people had escaped Treblinka. People already had reported back into the resistance networks to anybody who, was very well connected, which she was, and wanted to hear. They already knew what was happening to some extent at Treblinka because there had been some survivors, right? So for Irena, that moment was this sort of horrifying moment of literally watching what she thought of as her children carrying things that she had smuggled in go to what she understood was their death. That moment is also an amazing part of the story having to do with Allah. Alla, as chief nurse in the Warsaw Ghetto, she that day was also one of the people who witnessed Stefa and Korczak at the Umschlagplatz. She was known as the good fairy of the Umschlagplatz. And she and a gentleman named Nachum Remba, who was in the Jewish resistance, in part of the ghetto, Jewish ghetto uprising ultimately, as was Alla. They went to the deportation, to the rail yard, and the Germans were ostensibly reporting that these were just deportations. And so they said, well, okay, we'll play along with your game, and we'll pretend that these are just deportations. They set up a medical clinic, and they said anybody who is ill cannot travel. And so they were able to save the lives of some very, very important people leading the Jewish resistance inside the ghetto. And we're working with somebody whose name you may also have encountered, named Marek Edelman. He was one of the people they worked with that day to save members of the resistance so that the activism could continue. And they were able to save some children, although that was mostly adults that they were able to save that day. And they talk about how in the tents, they broke people's legs because the Germans needed to be persuaded that certain members of the resistance really couldn't travel. And so there were cases where they broke people's bones so that they would legitimately not have an excuse not to travel that day. But Nachum Remba was one of the last people to speak to Korczak. He said that he was one of the ones who, from their clinic tent, saw Korczak and Stefa and the children, and he was the person who tried to intervene and said, you know, please let me try to stop this. The Germans agreed to let Korczak not go to Treblinka if Stefa and the children would go. And that was the moment where Korczak famously said, you know, you don't leave a sick child in the night, and you don't leave kids in a moment like this. And Nachum Remba talks in his memoirs about just collapsing in hysterics, right? Irena that day also ended up, she made her way home and her mother had to call an ambulance, right? I mean, ultimately, Irena Sandler she has a hysterical breakdown that night. She says, you know, that was just the most horrifying thing that she'd ever seen. Ultimately, Alla also had a daughter who was 6 at that time named Rami. Rami is also one of the child survivors that I spoke to for this book. And one of Irena's children. Rami was 6, 7 around this time. She's one of, her mother made the decision to give Rami to Irena and asked Irena to take Alla and put her in hiding. And so Rami survived the war. She has grandchildren today who are nurses and doctors. But Alla did not survive. Ultimately, she and Nachum Remba and Nachum Remba's wife, whose name I'm forgetting right now, unfortunately, they fought in the ghetto uprising and were a very, very important part of the resistance. They were arrested. The wife, I can't remember her name, I won't go into the brutality. The wife didn't survive, right? Young women in that moment did not tend to survive to be sent to concentration camps. They were ultimately sent to Poniatowa, which was one of the concentration camps, but not at that point one of the death camps. And they organized a movement trying to break out. They had a plan to try to break out of the concentration camp. Ultimately, the Germans liquidated that camp, and Alla and the other members barricaded themselves in a warehouse, refused to go to line up at the mass graves, and were ultimately burned in the building. So Alla does not survive, but her daughter very much did. And you know, for me, one of the important parts, I think, of Stefa's work and of Janusz's work and Irena's work and Alla's work is the fact that generations are ultimately exponential, right? I mean, it doesn't in any way make okay the thing, you know, it doesn't undo the wrongness of it, but the fact that Rami has a daughter and a granddaughter does mean something about what it meant, you know, ultimately for Irena and Alla and Stefa and Janusz to have done the things that they did. So by the time of the actions, really what happens when the liquidations are, now the roundups are beginning, at this moment, Alla and her friends are just going door to door, right? They go door to door, knock on the doors of strangers and say, look, they're going to come, they're going to liquidate your neighborhood tomorrow. They were able to get information in advance often about where the roundups were going to be. And she would go and she would knock on the doors of strangers and say, will you give me your baby, right? That was one of the ways that Beata Fikowska was saved, was in those circumstances. And she says, often there would be these terrible conflicts in a family where the parents were willing to agree, but the grandparents weren't, and they would say, give us more time and come back tomorrow, and then they would come back the next day and the entire neighborhood was gone. Ultimately, Arena's estimate, we were talking about this earlier, Arena's estimate is that by the end of the war, from the beginning to the end, she and all of the women in this network, right, not Arena alone, she was very, very clear in saying at the end of the war that she made a list of all of the people who helped her, and that list was 14 pages long. She estimated that for every child they were able to save, 10 people in Warsaw had to risk their lives in order to get that child to safety. She says that the estimate is that as many as 2,500 children may have ultimately been saved in this way. So that's really I always want to clarify the part of the 2,500 children saved, because at the moment that's a huge controversy, especially in Poland, about that particular number. Although I think it is a fair point to remember that Irena Sendler is not the only person who did this. That the stories of people like Alla and Stefa and Janusz and Rachela, who does survive, and Eva, who does not survive, right? All of these, Sophia, who does not survive, right? I mean, all of these women. And it was primarily women, largely because Warsaw during the German occupation, there were not a lot of men, right? I mean, there were older men, there were children, but any man of a military age was not permitted to hang around in Warsaw to foment revolution, right? That was not something that was permitted. So one of the things that, what was I going to say? Lost my train of thought there. Let's see. What's that? I know it happens. It happens to us, especially if you do it without notes, right? Anyhow, I've forgotten totally what I was going to say there. But to begin again, so that's the story, right? The main parameter then of the story of Irena Sendler and this group of women involved with that network, right? One of the things, I know what I was going to say, which is why Irena Sendler got so much of the credit, and it's really the fact that two things. One, so many of the women involved did not survive, right? Irena herself said later, the reason that I'm the famous one is I live to be old, and I live to tell the story. And after the Second World War, so when I write her biography, I said in the beginning that the Cold War part of that biography remains to be told. I kind of tell the story up to 1945, and at least for Irena, it ends happily in the short term, right? So she survives, Adam survives, they both get divorces, they get married, they have kids, right? In that limited scope, a number of the children that she saved became members of their family. Beata Fikowska was with her when she died and thought of her as a second mother. It was another young woman named Teresa who lived with the family for many years. There's this wonderful story, at least at the end, of how they do make it through and they have a family. Unfortunately, what happens after 1945 is not such a happy story because for Irena or for any of these activists, because during the Stalinist and then communist period in Poland, you can imagine that the last thing that the Soviets desired was to have activists, well-organized activists who were committed to the Polish state, right? Because throughout all of this, Irena understood her actions to be not only, she understood them to be about social justice and about ethics and about what was correct to do, but she also understood that that was what it meant to be Polish, right? So in her mind, she was absolutely engaged in what she thought of was an act of patriotic Polish resistance as well, right? For her, those were not those were not mutually exclusive ideas, right? And so, and that was really many of the people, not only in her organization, which was later in the war, ultimately became affiliated with an organization known as Żegada, but also for the people who fought in the Home Army, right? So there was this notion that they were fighting for Poland and for the independence of Poland, because it is true that the German program was not only to exterminate the Jewish nation, but also the Polish nation, right? That was also a stated objective. After the Soviet period, though, nobody wanted Polish patriotic activists, and so there were huge roundups. Many of Arena's collaborators were executed in the decade following the war. I don't write a great deal about this in the book, in part because there's only so much a reader can take, right? I mean, right, I've almost got you crying already, right? I mean, like, think if I'd gone on, right? Yeah, you know, ultimately, suffice it to say, Arena at one point is pregnant. She herself is arrested and interrogated by the Soviets for her activism, and is beaten badly enough that she loses the child, right? So, I mean, it would just sort of give you a sense of the kind of danger that Arena herself was in. And so it's one of the reasons why people always say, well, why has the story of Arena Sendler not been told until the 2000s? Like, right, why all of a sudden after, you know, in the late 90s and in 2000 can we hear the story of Arena Sendler? Why did we never hear these stories before? And the answer is it was simply too dangerous in Poland for anybody to talk about that. That you would not, and Arena's family was in huge danger during that period. Her children were denied educations. There was at least one occasion where one of the children that she saved happened to be married to a senior government official and was able to intervene to stop the execution of an arrest and death warrant for Arena in the post-war period that we know about. So these stories really got buried, right? And hidden, and then it was really only with the end of the Cold War that suddenly the stories began to be told. And I know that when I was in Poland just under a decade ago, I mean, it was probably the first moment that people felt comfortable and safe enough to begin telling those stories again. And my feeling is probably, although Jerry might have a better sense, I think you'll agree, and my sense is that that moment probably has passed again for a generation. That it's the current government in Poland is a very right-wing government, and Arena's story is being manipulated for political reasons that are not ones that she would support. I think we can say that at the moment Arena would not like what's being done to her story, because her story is being used in the contemporary, by the contemporary Polish government. See, we'll get arrested if this video, I'll get arrested now going to Warsaw, won't I? Because Polish people did participate, right? Polish people did participate in anti-Semitic acts against Jewish people in Poland, which is not something that you can freely say at the moment in Poland. And that story is really being recast, right, in a very particular way at the moment, in ways that I'm certain that Arena herself would ultimately not agree with. So chances are we will not find out the stories really about what happened in the Cold War for another, probably it's another 50 or 60 years before we'll hear that. So I think probably I'll stop there. I'm at my 53-minute mark. So I'll stop there. But if you have other questions at all, I'm happy to take. I have 5 minutes for questions. Yeah,
okay.
Is that all right?
It's okay. Yeah.
Any questions or things you'd like to hear more about?
Why is the number that children say is huge right now?
Yeah, so part of the current political, and Jerry is really in a much better position, but correct me if I've got this wrong, Jerry, but my impression of the situation at the moment in Poland is that, so originally Arena's story got picked up in the United States, right, through the Life in the Jar program, and that got pretty readily adopted by a kind of Christian fundamentalist community, is one of the things that happened with that book and that program, right? So, which isn't anything to do with Arena's story, except that at the end of Arena's life, she becomes a devout reconvert to Catholicism, right? So one of the things that happens is, as a young woman, she leads what is obviously a somewhat bohemian lifestyle. And then, like many of us, she gets older, right? She maybe doesn't want to talk quite so publicly about her bohemian youthful days, especially since they were, she was quite bohemian as a younger woman, right? And so she doesn't want to talk about those. She then ultimately becomes devoutly Catholic after the death of her second child, and in Poland after the war, right? She becomes very, very devoutly Catholic. And is very, very, just very, very passionate about her Catholicism. So one of the things that happened when her story first came out is because there is such a strong Christian element, right, to the way the story was told in the 90s, right, that became aligned, I think just coincidentally, not deliberately in any way, with certain kinds of politics that were more on the right than on the left, right? Which is kind of ironic because Irena's politics early on were very, very far on the left. So one of the kind of pressures on Irena's legacy is this idea of whether she's a saint, right? I mean, I've actually given talks where I've said, that I'm not interested in thinking about Irena as a saint, but in large part because, although I grew up Catholic, I'm not at all religious, and so I don't really believe in saints. So, and I've had people who are Catholic get very, very angry at me at the idea of how do I know she isn't really truly a saint? I'm like, well, I don't even care. I mean, like, the thing is I just don't care, right? Like, I'm not interested in that part of the story personally. But, so that's on the one hand, right? There's already this kind of Christian overlay. There is a controversy from the period about the fact that the children who were put in the orphanages in order to be hidden, Irena at the time tended to think that it was enough to give them false paperwork. There were a number of people on the Polish Aryan side, right, who believed that those children needed to be actually baptized, right? And that became a huge controversy, and I mean, understandably made the Jewish community furious, right? So there was always this history as well. I think we lost our sound. There was always this history as well of this kind of there's always this kind of Christian fundamentalist push, right? Then what happens in Poland is that a far-right government committed to really a kind of Catholic version of Poland and a kind of retrograde perspective on what it meant to be Polish comes to power, and that was what, 3 or 4 years ago, is that right? So 3 or 4 years ago, Poland makes a very, very hard turn politically to the right. And so now what you have is a Polish government that's deeply invested in the idea that Irena stands for, as she herself, I think, would have agreed, she stands for a certain version of what it means to be Polish. It's just the version that she's standing for at the moment might have been the version at the end of her life that she thought she stood for, but it wasn't really the moment that her actions at the beginning of her life would have represented, right? So what's happened then is that there are a series of very laudatory books about her, and then there has been on the left recently a very controversial and quite celebrated book on the far left, basically talking about the ways in which Irena's story has become exaggerated. So in Poland at the moment, this is a huge controversy, right? But there is, one of the things I say in my biography of Irena is that, I'm not interested in whether she's a saint, right? Because for me, the part that is interesting is that if she's a saint, right, then all of us are off the hook, aren't we? Right? Then we're excused. Because I don't know about you, I'm not a saint. So if only saints have to stand up for social justice and take those kinds of risks and show moral courage in moments of wrongness, then I'm off the hook and probably all of you are off the hook, right?
Then there will be no social
Then
justice.
exactly. Because there are not enough
saints.
saints to exercise social justice in the world. But if Irena Sendler is not a saint, if she is an average, flawed, complicated human being who, faced with a terrible situation, demonstrated what I think is really unspeakable physical and moral courage, and she did it not just once, but she woke up every single day over a period of years and did it. Like when I think to myself in my own kind of private moral reckoning, right, I would like to think that I could have once done that, right? That faced with that situation one day, I think I would like to believe I would have gone into the ghetto and I would have got a kid and I would have done that, right? That I would have been that person. But when I am more honest with myself about would I have woken up every single day and done that, knowing that I was putting my own family at risk of execution by doing that. Like, would I have gotten up every single day and done that over years? Like, I'm less confident of my own goodness, unfortunately, right? I mean, I say that with all humility and, and not any pride in that, but like the amount of physical and moral courage that it took to have done that was really astonishing. And, for me, the more important part of that story is if she was a normal person and she found the courage to do that, then none of us are off the hook, right? And so for me, that's the real problem with that political argument is, it might further certain nationalist or, political ideals, but I'm not sure how it furthers the things that Arena and Korczak and Stefa would have believed in, which were certain kinds of social, ways of thinking of activism and social justice in a, and I think in a Republican social welfare context. So yeah. One more question, anybody? Yeah, please, yeah,
I
comment.
think it's more like integrity. If you have full integrity, you could go all the way. Like, but there were many resistant people, like Jean Moulin. Jean Moulin went all the way, and he died. But I'm sure that if he was alive now and would ask him, would you do it again, he would do it. There are people like that. Like, if you have integrity, you keep it.
Well, Arena always said afterwards, it's like for Arena, part of the story I didn't tell, she is arrested by the Gestapo at one moment, right? And she talks about the irony of the fact that, so one of the things she did is when she took the children out of the ghetto, she promised the parents that she would write down their real names, right, on a list, which was from, a logistical perspective, an idiot idea, right? Like, that's really dangerous, that's a huge risk, that's not a good idea. But from a human perspective, of course, you have to promise that to parents, right, that you can find your kids again. And so she keeps this list, and she talks about how she's arrested by the Gestapo, and she's tortured. She never walks without a limp again, right? She's very, very badly tortured by the Gestapo. She doesn't reveal anything. She's on her way to her execution by firing squad, right? She's lined up on her way out, and as she's on the way, she's pushed by the German officer at the door in the other direction, and she thinks she's going to be interrogated more. She talks about wishing that she'd had cyanide with her, because thinking, she would have committed suicide in that moment, knowing she believed she was going back into torture, right, and interrogation. And instead, what she later found out is that the Jewish community had paid the biggest bribe that they paid ever during the Polish period to free her. And it wasn't because they loved Arena, although they loved Arena, it was because she had the names of where their kids were, right? And so she talks about the irony, and she says, I thought I was saving the kids with the list, but in the end, right, it was the list of the children that saved her, right? So I always think there's this kind of just, amazing kind of symmetry of the ways in which, sometimes when we think we're saving somebody, we're saving ourselves at the same time, right? There's this really kind of powerful symmetry to that story. But the thing she said later is she said, one, she never stopped having nightmares, right? That to the end of her life, she said, I have nightmares, especially of those moments of asking families to give up their kids, right? Like of those moments. And then she said, the only thing I wish is that we didn't do enough. She's like, I spend time thinking we didn't do enough, right? And it's this kind of, astonishing thing to hear from somebody who lives with the kind of trauma of that for decades. And what she'd said was, not only would I have gone all the way, as you're saying, but that, my regret is that we didn't get everybody, right? I somehow didn't do enough, which of course is a kind of, typical post-traumatic response as well of, thinking somehow in the moment of moral courage, acting in the face of trauma, you don't act correctly, right? I think any psychologist would say that that's a very typical response, but that she lived with that, forever. So I think you're right. I hope, though, would you feel confident that you would do it? I would like to believe I would, but I don't know.
From where I come from, I would.
You would.
I would die too.
Yeah. Well, then we're sticking with you. You're the one we need to lead the charge for us, I think.
So I met Karen recently, and while listening about her book, I thought, wow, that would be an incredible touch for our institute. So, you know, as we're all kind of crazy, this part of the group, I mean, this part. So I approached Karen with the idea, well, how about coming to Vancouver? And she crazily said, sure. So that's how it worked. So let me read about Karen for me not to make any factual mistakes. So after 18 years of practicing law, and she's a lawyer by training in Seattle, Karen Trigger felt an unmistakable call to explore the story of her in-laws, who are both Holocaust survivors from Poland, Sam and Esther Goldberg. Educated at Barnard College and New York University Law School, where she was editor-in-chief of New York University Law Review, Trigger made the momentous decision to retire from her law practice. I said, we're all crazy, right? Together with the threads of the family story she had heard for many years. The result of her 3-year inquiry is the widely praised book, which I read, a wonderful book, I strongly recommend. My Soul is Filled with Joy. The book is here, and you can look through, and it's on Kindle as well, right?
Audio too.
Yeah. The book recently won a prestigious award, a bronze medal from the Independent Publishers Book Award in the category of World History. In June, she traveled to Poland, she just came back, to launch the Polish translation of the book and to speak in Warsaw and at the Krakow Jewish Festival. She has been named to the Jewish Book Council Authors Network and the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanities Speakers Bureau. So without further ado.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I apologize for the typo on Janusz's name. It should have a Z at the end, so thank you for pointing that out. So it happens, you know. I put this together after I got back from Poland. I think I was jet-lagged. But thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And I am going to talk about not a cheery topic. I'm not going to so much talk about the book that I wrote, which is here. The reason that what I'm going to talk about is Treblinka. And the idea, that's where Dr. Korczak and the orphans found their end. They were murdered there. And so my suggestion was that perhaps that would be an interesting topic. And I did a lot of research about Treblinka because my father-in-law, Sam Goldberg, who I wrote about in this book, was at Treblinka for 13 months, which is the longest. There was only one other person that survived Treblinka that was there for 13 months. So, and he was part of the uprising, and I did a lot of work on trying to understand what that place was. So without further ado, I wanted to I know you all are very familiar with Dr. Korczak, and when I did my research, I of course had heard about him, and then I realized, oh, that's not actually his birth name. His birth name is Henryk Goldschmidt, which he took the name Janusz Korczak as a pen name as he was writing his children's books. So that was interesting for me. But the story really revolves here today for Dr. Korczak and his orphanage children around Treblinka. But in order to understand Treblinka, so I guess fair warning that this is not going to be a cheery talk. So I apologize in advance about that. But it's really important to understand what happened in this place where 870,000, mostly Jews, a few thousand Roma, were murdered in gas chambers and by shooting and by hanging and by starvation and well, there really wasn't that much starvation, to be honest, because people weren't there long enough to starve. That's the truth about that. So it all starts, though, with this gentleman, Adolf Hitler, who had this great world theory that the Aryan race, the German people, are of the highest caliber of people in the world, and that everyone else is below them, is other. And the Jews had a particularly low status as subhuman. They were not human, in fact, they were vermin, and they needed to be eradicated. But I think Hitler in the beginning didn't think he would be so successful, and just as successful as he was in eradicating the Jews of Europe. So he thought that he would get rid of them.
he wanted to make German and German-controlled territories Judenrein, free or clean of Jews. That was his original idea. So like in 1939, when he attacks Poland from the west, he doesn't have a plan. That's what we know now in 2019. That's called the final solution of the Jewish question, to murder the Jews of Europe where they live, in the place, mostly on Polish soil. And, but this is what happens in the beginning. So I'm going to use my cursor, and I'm just going to use over here, if people can look over here for just a second. This map really helped me understand my in-laws' story during the war much better than I did before. And I find that it's, well, you'll see why I think it's useful for the beginning of this story. So here is Germany, and here's the Soviet Union, and this is Poland, this over here. Now, Germany and the Soviet Union make a friendship pact in August, end of August 1939. They say, hey, we'll be friends, let's make a deal. We won't attack each other. We, the Germans, will attack from the west, attack Poland from the west, from this way, and you guys, the Soviets, Stalin, you attack from the east. Then we'll split it down the middle, pretty much down the middle, and you take that side, we take this side, that's a deal. That was the deal they cut. And that's in fact what happened. September 1, 1939, the Germans attacked from the west. 2 weeks later, the Soviets attacked from the east. And this is in fact the border that becomes the border between the German-controlled part of Poland and the Soviet-controlled part of Poland. Now, over here, the Germans very quickly annexed, my cursor's not exactly the right place, but they annexed like a chunk over here that had, in the olden days, been part of what they considered to be Germany. Then Soviets controlled this, and then in the middle here, there was this section of Poland that was under German control called the General Government, or General Gouvernement, if you want to make it sound fancy. In English it's easier to say government. And that is the area where my in-laws' families were from. Bagatella is my father-in-law Sam Goldberg's family town. It's a tiny, when I say tiny, I mean really, really tiny farming village. And my mother-in-law, Esther Vishnu, is from Suchek, which it's not too far away, but they didn't know each other until 1943. And, but her town is a shtetl, a very typical Jewish shtetl. It's a little town primarily inhabited by Jewish people. Her father, where my father-in-law's family, Sam's family, were farmers and traders in timber and cattle. My mother-in-law's family her father was a teacher of young children about Jewish subjects, a malamed, it's called in Yiddish. So, like this, it was not, even though there was no plan to murder all the Jews under German control, they wanted them really to leave. It wasn't a good idea, wasn't a happy place to stay and live as a Jew. And so, like hundreds of thousands of other Jews living in this German-controlled area, both the Vishnu family and the Goldberg family go across that yellow line. They go east. And Esther's family went pretty far east, and Sam's family just went a little bit east. But they lived under Soviet control in those first almost 2 years of the war. You could be a citizen. You weren't murdered. You could be, the Soviets, in fact, they didn't believe in religion. So a Jewish person was a citizen just like a Catholic person, like a Russian Orthodox person. Everyone was a citizen. Fine. But then Hitler takes his lovely agreement that he makes with the Soviet Union and he rips it up. June 22nd, 1941, so almost 2 years later, and Germany attacks the Soviet Union. And they start from that yellow line, and they go this way into the eastern area of Poland, and then further in with four battalions of army units into the areas of the former Soviet Union. And this is where we begin to see what we now know as the final solution. Because the army units were followed very quickly by a special army unit called the Einsatzgruppen. And their job was to go to each town that was conquered by the Germans and gather the Jews of the town and take them out of town and shoot them into a pit, one by one, with bullets. And this is how Esther's family were all murdered in Slonim, which is, there were about 10,000 Jews in Slonim, and in August of 1941, they were all taken out of town and shot one by one into a pit. Esther survived that massacre because she was suffering from typhus, and she was in a hospital in Slonim when this massacre happened. And miraculously, she left because a few days later, the Einsatzgruppen came back to Slonim to mop up, clean up, and they went into that same hospital and they murdered all of the patients in their beds, which were all Jewish patients. Now, I'm hoping that Esther didn't know that that happened because she left, but I found it through my research, a different testimony that someone testified about this murder, and I'm like, what? 2 days after she gets the hell out of there, they come back and kill everybody. Whoa, okay. The truth is though, anybody that survived the Holocaust has many of these miraculous stories that happened to them. Because otherwise most people didn't survive, right? So this happens, this Slonim massacre happens, and they kill in this manner 1 million, who knows, numbers are, no one knows real numbers, but somewhere between 1 million and 1.3 million people are murdered, Jews are murdered, east of that yellow line by the Einsatzgruppen with bullets. Now mind you, they had local people who helped them, some voluntary, some not voluntary, but they did this mass murder in these called mass killing fields over and over again. And these soldiers, even though they were well trained to try their best to see the people they were killing, not as people, but as vermin, to make it so that they could do it, it was still really tough. There were nervous breakdowns all day long. They're shooting human beings this far away from each other. I'm shooting you, God forbid. But it's very close, it's very personal. They were having nervous breakdowns, and they had so much alcohol. There are stories and stories about how before they'd go, they'd send the soldiers out to these killing fields, that they would get all the soldiers drunk. And that's how and then there was more drink later. It was constantly drunk in order to get them to carry out this horrible, horrible act. So the German echelon in the Reich were trying to figure out a better way to do this. There had to be a better way. So they looked into their grab bag of ways to kill people, and they had a good example. And the example was from the T4 youth. It's called T4 because of the street it was on. It's the euthanasia program that Hitler began in July of 1939. And it went all the way till August 1941, where they took mentally ill people, started out with children, but then it relatively quickly graduated to adults as well. Handicapped people, mentally ill people, and people that they deemed were not worthy of life. And they took them they took them on a bus to these hospitals, and doctors, real doctors, MDs, dressed in white coats, would take a look at these people and say, we will treat you, and then they would murder them. And they would write back to their families, we're so sorry, your loved one died in our care. No one knew they were murdering all these people. But they started doing it first with lethal injections, and then this way and that way, but they ultimately found that gassing them was a really great way to murder these people. So these doctors had experimented for these 2 years with killing by gas. So they tried it out at Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz was a place that did not start out as a death extermination place of Jews. It started out as a prisoner of war camp for Poles. It began in spring of 1940. And prisoners of war, Polish prisoners of war, were taken here. And then after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1942, there were, just a shitload more of prisoners of war. And they got many hundreds of thousands of them were sent to concentration camps, one of them being Auschwitz. And it was in September of 1941, so remember that's just, June, July, August, September. That's 3 months after Germany attacked the Soviet Union. They try out the idea of murdering some of these prisoners with gas. They tried it out in the infamous Block 11 at Auschwitz, which was the torture it's a well-known place that it was the place of torture and murder, and they did the gas experiment in Block 11, and it worked great. Rudolf Hess, who was the commandant of Auschwitz, was so happy that this worked so well. He was like, this is great. Now we have a solution, an alternative to all the shooting. Okay? This is how it starts. Then they tried it out in Chelmno. Chelmno, in December 8th, 1941, so remember the experiment is September, now we're just jump a couple months ahead. They took Jews, they started out with Jews from Lodz, town nearby, and they put them into trucks. And the back of the truck was sealed, like a cupboard, and they took a pipe from the exhaust. So, trucks, unless you have an electric car, makes exhaust, and they put the pipe right into the cabin of the car, and then they would close it, and they would drive the vans a ways, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes, 50 minutes, out into the forest. By the time they got out to the forest, everyone inside was dead. They were asphyxiated from the carbon monoxide from the vehicle that they were in. Then they would dump them into a pit and go back and do it again. And this started in Chelmno, so this was working great. This was a really better way to murder people. No one had to see them die. No one had to physically shoot anybody. This was a good plan. This is a picture of some Jews from Lodz leaving their town, going to die in Chelmno in these vans. They had their packages. At this stage of the game, the final solution, these people really, I don't think, had any idea what was about to happen to them. The death camps hadn't been built yet. They thought they were being relocated, taking the small packages that they could carry, but they didn't get relocated. They got murdered. So then, December 1941, we're still at the end of 1941, Hitler says, the world war is here. The annihilation of world Jewry must be the necessary consequence. And Hans Frank, who was the governor of that area that in Poland, controlled by Germans, called the General Government, he was really another really terrible guy. He told all of his people, all of his officers that had to go out into the field and were tasked with this job, gentlemen, I must ask you to rid yourselves of all feeling of pity. We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them in order to maintain the structure of the Reich as a whole. So extermination of the Jews becomes a wartime policy. And they sell it to their people by making them believe that we are talking about the survival of the German people. We must kill all the Jews in order for the German people to survive. They made it seem like it was an act of self-defense to kill the Jews, and they weren't real people anyway, so it's okay. So at the Wannsee conference, another month later, this is where all the leaders of the Reich get together and really get their marching orders about how we're going to do this. It's a famous conference, there's all kinds of studies about it, but what happens, before we get to the setting up of the death camps, and this quote is very powerful. So it's a month after Wannsee. The Fuhrer declares once again that he has decided, once again, that he has decided to do away ruthlessly with the Jews in Europe. In this matter, one should not have any sentimental impulses. The Jews have deserved the catastrophe that they are now experiencing. We must accelerate this process with cold determination, as in so doing, we render a priceless service to humanity, which for millennia was tortured by Jews. Okay, this is by Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister. This was the line that was fed to everyone who was involved in this process. So, they built killing centers, I call them death camps, and there were 3 that were built in between January, let's say February of 1942 and June of 1942, June, July. The first one that's built, so Chelmno we talked about already, and the first one that's built is Belzec, then Sobibor, and then Treblinka. These become the triumvirate of what is known in Holocaust colloquium as the death camps, or the Operation Reinhard death camps, and I'll explain that in a second. But before I explain that, I just want to point out, on this map also has Auschwitz, and Majdanek. Now Auschwitz, I explained, started out as a prisoner of war camp, a slave labor camp, and then around end of 1942, 43, it becomes a hybrid extermination camp when Birkenau was built with 5 gas chambers and crematoria, and to start to murder more Jews, they needed more capacity to kill all those Jews. Because now they had to get rid of the Jews, but getting rid of the Jews meant murdering the Jews. And then Majdanek is a very similar story. It was built as a prisoner of war camp, as a slave labor camp. Jews and non-Jews were in Majdanek until the end. Well, the Jews were all murdered before the end of the camp, but it became also a place of extermination. But when people talk about the Operation Reinhard death camps, of which Treblinka is one, they're referring to this gentleman, may he rot in hell, Reinhard Heydrich, who was one of the master planners of the final solution. He was murdered in Czechoslovakia, where he was the governor, the German governor, in May of 1942. And Hitler and Himmler were so upset by his murder, their good friend, they decided to name the operation of these death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, after him as an honor to him. So that's why they're called Operation Reinhard camps. So now let's focus on Treblinka. Can you give me a 10-minute warning when I should try to hurry up?
Let's say 12 minutes from now, okay? And then
15.
15.
Yeah, I can't do this in 12.
No, okay. That's
Okay.
yeah,
All right, here we
not
go.
easy.
The first commandant of Treblinka was Dr. Irmfried Eberl. He was trained at that euthanasia program that I mentioned before. He was a physician, a medical physician, who was the first commandant. And I think it's around 92 of the doctors and medical personnel that were at Operation T4, the euthanasia program, were, after it was shut down in 41, they were repurposed and put into the death camps to run these gas extermination program. And my father-in-law, Sam Goldberg, was captured in a town that's about 15 miles away from Treblinka in June of 1942. 135 men were captured and taken there by truck. Their job was to build the camp. And this was a pattern that was used for all the Operation Reinhard death camps. They captured Jews in nearby towns and brought them to the area and had them build the camp, except the gas chambers. So my father-in-law was forced to build the camp, and he survived in this camp until the uprising, August of 1943. So this is a picture of the Unschlagplatz, which you pronounced much better than I can, Unschlagplatz in Warsaw, where the Jews were taken. Treblinka was built where it was because it was 65 miles away from Warsaw, and it was built with the specific intent of primarily murdering the Jews of Warsaw. It was the largest Jewish population in all of Poland and concentrated in one place. And by the time many Jews from outlying areas were also brought there to the ghetto. So it was a huge Jewish population, and they were brought here to this place and taken from here by train to Treblinka, the 65 miles. The deportations began on July 22nd, 1942, and the murdering began the next day, July 23rd, 1942. Now, it was 13 days later that Dr. Korczak and his orphans are deported, August 5th, 1942. That's when they were deported to Treblinka. And when I looked this up to prepare for this talk, and I was like, wow, they were taken very early in that action. But every day, 5,000 to 7,000 Warsaw Jews were transported to Treblinka by train. So they were of the 5,000 Jews that were taken on that one day. And what happened was, Dr. Eberl that I mentioned, he was a commandant, he wanted to impress Himmler and Hitler, and he wanted to be like the star commandant and kill the most Jews of any death camp. That was his goal. But there were only 3 small gas chambers set up in Treblinka. They could fit 250 to 350 people, something like that. So you couldn't kill 5,000 people a day in 3 small gas chambers. So by the end of August, September, they're building more. But in the meantime, he orders the Ukrainian guards to start shooting people as they get off the trains. because just shoot a bunch of them right away, then we'll get rid of their bodies and we won't have to fit them into the gas chambers. It'll be much easier. So I was trying to imagine that changes because he makes a big fat mess of everything, because bodies, excuse me, this is a really awful image, but bodies start piling up all over the camp because they're shooting them as they're coming off the train, and they don't have enough people to like get them out of the way. So the place stinks like hell, and there's bodies everywhere, and people describe it as just this scene from some really horror movie that thank God hasn't been written yet, and at least not that I've seen. So I was trying to imagine what was it like when Dr. Korczak got off the train with these orphans. The main procedure took about 90 minutes. Get off the train, the men and women were separated. So I don't know what happened with Dr. Korczak and his orphans, whether the girls and boys were separated or he was able to keep them together. I don't know. But generally, the men and the women were separated. The men, especially in the beginning, were undressed outside in the reception area and then taken straight down what people called what they called the road to heaven, straight into the gas chamber. The women and the girls were taken into an indoor undressing barracks where they undressed and had their hair shorn, and then they too had to run down the road to heaven straight into the gas chamber. The whole process took 90 minutes till they were dead. In the gas chamber, it only took 25 minutes to murder. So I was wondering, I read this in Timothy Snyder's book, and not that I'm a doctor, I'm married to one, but I'm not. But I found this to be an interesting idea, like how exactly they were killed by carbon monoxide. It was similar to the Khando vans. There was a old Soviet truck, old Soviet tank actually, that the exhaust from it was piped into the gas chamber, and that's what killed them. And carbon monoxide binds much better than oxygen to the hemoglobin in the blood, and thereby prevents red blood cells from performing their normal function of bringing oxygen to tissues. So basically their cells were asphyxiated by the gas. That's really what happened to them. And that was, when I read that, I was like, oh, because I mean, that was pretty interesting for me. Interesting, like terrifying. But I think that's what the place looked like though when Janusz Korczak was murdered there with those orphans. The place was a mess. It was Dante's Inferno hell zone. This guy Everell got in a lot of trouble because he was made such a mess of the place, and he got replaced at the end of August. But Korczak's came on the 6th or the 7th, right? He's gone, his orphans are murdered, they're over, they're history. But Everell gets fired because they see what a mess he made. And this guy with the white, he wore this white riding jacket, and he rode a horse all around Treblinka. His name is Franz Stengel, and he was appointed as the commandant. And he stayed as the commandant actually until the uprising in August of 1943. So I want to this is Kurt Franz. He was one of the worst of the SS officers at Treblinka. But I will tell you that if it worked for this gentleman, this horrible gentleman, may he also rot in hell, my father-in-law probably wouldn't have survived. He liked, for some reason, he liked my father-in-law. We would ask Sam, like, why did he help you? And he's like, I don't know. He said he liked my eyes. So Sam never really understood it, but he did in fact help me. He appointed him as the supervisor of the laundry, which was a really good job at Treblinka because you were inside, you could cook in the pots. It was actually a good job there, as jobs at Treblinka go. But I wanted to share with you some pictures. That guy, Kurt Franz, he survived the war. And ultimately he was caught years later, tried, and put into prison until he got older and became sick, and then he was taken out and put in some nice nursing home, which pisses me off, but whatever. He took pictures of the place, and Yad Vashem has the photo album, and he put these pictures together in a photo album after the war, and he titled it, this is so disgusting, he titled the photo album, The Good Old Days. Yad Vashem has the photo album, and this is just a few pictures because you get a glimpse, because all of Treblinka was destroyed after the uprising in November, the Germans destroyed everything that was there. But this gives a tiny glimpse of what it looked like. I don't think it looked like this necessarily when Korczak arrived, because that was only 13 days after operations began, and they continued to build different structures in the camp throughout. Was a warehouse, probably a warehouse of some kind, and there was, believe it or not, Kurt Franz, the Lalka, he was called the Lalka because that's Polish for beautiful, because he was so handsome. And that was his nickname. But he made a menagerie, he made a little zoo. And I'm not kidding, there were bears and foxes. These are his own pictures. That's just like, what? Okay, yeah. And then what happened was after the Germans lost the Battle of Stalingrad in February of 1943, Himmler got a little nervous, shall we say, that perhaps the Germans weren't going to win the war. So he commanded everyone at Treblinka to start burning the bodies of the Jews that they murdered, because they had been just throwing them into a pit, huge open graves, hundreds of thousands of bodies. They would cover them up and then do another layer. And so he ordered them to begin to burn the bodies to get rid of the evidence. But not only that, he ordered them to dredge with this big dredge thing to take the bodies out of the mass graves and burn them. So, of course, who had to do these awful jobs? It was the Jews. There was a workforce of about 800 Jews in the camp, one of whom was my father-in-law. But there was an uprising, August 2nd, 1943, and that's a picture of the uprising on the day that it happened from about 10 miles away. And my father-in-law was one of the planners of the uprising. Most people who were there that day did not survive the war. Half of them didn't even survive getting out of the camp. But my father-in-law did, and he ran and he ran and he ran, and like the story of their meeting is after he runs away from here, my mother-in-law has been hiding in the forest about 15 miles away with the help of some Christian families. And he's running away and they meet in the forest. And he says, I just escaped from Treblinka. And she's like, what? What? You know, we had an uprising, he tells the whole thing, and she takes him to the Christian families that have been helping her. And they help him also. And they hide together for another year in a pit in the forest that they dig out nearby here, and then they're liberated by the Soviet Army in the summer of 1944. So there were other uprisings, just briefly, besides Treblinka. The Warsaw Ghetto is very famous. Sobibor, one of the other Operation Reinhardt death camps, had an uprising October of 1943 after Treblinka's. Auschwitz, Birkenau, the Starter Commandos, the people who had to work in the gas chambers, had a completely unsuccessful uprising. In October of 1944, everyone was killed that was involved in that uprising. Treblinka, to summarize, had 870,000 people were murdered. Only about 65 survived till the end of the war, one of whom was my father-in-law. And of those that planned the uprising, about 12 to 15 survived. This is a very famous photo of some of the survivors of the planning committee, and this is my father-in-law here, Shmuel or Sam Goldberg, and yeah, he was a hero. He was a hero of everyone. And I was going to talk about Auschwitz and how the killing centers by the time 1943 ends, the death camps are shut down, and the mass killing program really shifts in full force over to Auschwitz and Majdanek. And that's where the killing continues really until the end of the war. But I mean, just to pull this together, these are the numbers of where and how, you know, the final solution of the Jewish question was pretty nearly achieved. 90% of the Jewish population of Poland, anyway, which had the most Jews, 3.3 million, were murdered over the course of 6 years, really 5 years. And you know, the fact that Dr. Korczak went with his orphans to this end obviously speaks loudly about who he was. And but I think that this place existed at all speaks to what we as humans have the capacity to actually do. It's hard to believe that we as human beings could have thought this up and executed it, but it happened. And I see my job as like trying to not be that type of human, because we make choices about what we do in life and how we live our lives. And the Germans and some Poles made choices about how they lived in a negative way, what we see as negative. Some made choices to live positively, like the Christian families that helped Sam and Esther, like Irina Sendler, like there are many, many of these stories, but if there only had been more of those stories, we wouldn't necessarily have had the same tragic result as we had. So, sorry it's a sad story, but that's the story of Treblinka, where Dr. Korczak and his orphans found their end. So, thank you for sharing the history with me, and yeah, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Sure.
I know it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to listen to, and it's even harder to comprehend and to try to understand. When I was listening to Karen, and also thank you, and also trying to think through, and of course I knew a lot about that, but each time I'm thinking the level of horror, which, as you said, no, I don't need that, thank you. The level of horror which humans can bring to other humans is unbelievable. But at the same time, what Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, but at the same time, in contrast to this, what Korczak did, and bringing really some happiness to the children who were destined to die, that's another story to think about. And if we put it on different, extremes, humanity, I think, is always a winner, regardless of millions and millions of people who died. But still, we're moving on and we're moving forward. That's my hope, that this kind of horrors remain behind. At the same time, when at our Korczak conference in August, when Marek Michalek, who was at the time Polish ombudsman, was presenting, he actually, at the end of his presentation, brought up the photos of the kids from Lepo. And he said, these are the kids who asked me to make their photos and show them to the world, for the world to remember and to know that they are there and they need help now. Yeah.
I would just like to point out that we are still detaining children in Canada, there are still detained children in the United States, there are children detained around
Yes.
the world. So, I just encourage people
It's happening,
to make a stand against that, in whichever way you can. Like, I don't know if people heard today, the Canadian pension plan is needing to pull out of investments that help detain these children in the United States. So there are still connections that we all have that require us to speak out.
Yeah. And, yeah, go ahead.
Just wanted to mention actually that in Syria there are still doctors who actually had fled Syria, and then they went back to help out in hospitals. And unfortunately some of these hospitals were bombarded. And so it hasn't gone, it's still happening, it's still awful.
So, if you have questions to Karen, please go ahead. And Karen, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It was really very powerful, although very hard. Yeah, but as the truth could be. Yeah.
Just, I know that,
Yeah.
I know that Hitler said he invaded Poland for the extra land for the Aryan race. Is there any kind of historical context to possibly because of the number of people who were Jewish in Poland? Is that partly why he invaded Poland first instead of?
I'm not a historian about general World War II strategy and Hitler, but nothing that I read was that. Yes, he wanted Lebensraum, so he invaded Poland. His idea was to also get all of Poland. I mean, he made
And
the
the
pact.
whole Europe.
Yeah, he made the pact with the Soviet Union that he knew from the beginning he wasn't going to keep that. That was a stopgap measure. And then he continued on. He really wanted the Ukraine because it's the breadbasket of Europe. He wanted the Ukraine. He thought that the Ukrainians and the Poles would be, his ultimate idea was that they would become, the Jews would be murdered, gotten rid of, At first he just wanted them out, send them to Madagascar, he had all kinds of Siberia, they had all kinds of plans, but then he wasn't gonna work, so he had to kill them where they were, and that was the final solution. That's why it's the final solution, and, because there were others first. The Slavs and the Poles and the Ukrainians were to be the slaves to the Germans. They were to be their workers, and the Germans were to be the lords. That was the ultimate plan that, thank goodness, did not come to be.
But in Poland, there was a part called, in French, called the Sudette, and actually Hitler said, he lied to the people and said that the Germans were being mistreated there, and so he used that just as some political...
As an excuse.
Yeah,
There was all kinds of excuses.
some president nowadays use the same excuse by saying that some people bring crime.
Judy,
Yeah,
you
but-
have a question?
I want to say that I think it took them 2 years or less to go from expelling them to go away, then putting them in concentration camp, and the concentration camp became too crowded, so they needed to kill them. So it's like 2 years, they evolved from expelling them, send them back to Russia or whatever, and then the final solution came from the necessity of no place for these Jews to go wherever.
Yeah, I agree with that, except just to clarify what you said, I agree, they ended up murdering them because they realized they couldn't get rid of them in another way. But I think in the first 2 years of the war, Jews weren't really sent to concentration camps, as we think about, like Auschwitz, Dachau, these camps. There were some Jews who went there, but it was mostly political enemies of anybody that the Reich thought was a political enemy, which was a very broad category. Priests, Polish priests were all sent, many were sent to Auschwitz. Journalists, political activists, anybody who was, and of course there were Jews in those categories, but Jews as a category of people, they could be killed, no problem. They were ghettoized starting already in the Krakow ghetto was 1941. There were ghettoizations. The idea originally was to concentrate them in order to move them en masse somewhere. But then they couldn't move them en masse. It wasn't going to work, so they had to figure out how to kill them. Then they started shooting them. 1 million people were shot. And then they said, there's got to be a better way. They came up with the gas. Therefore, they built the death camps and turned these POW camps, Majdanek and Auschwitz, into also killing centers. That's my understanding of the evolution. It wasn't like they got sent to concentration camps and then, oh, well, you're too many, we're going to kill you in this concentration camp. I don't think that.
So, yeah, my husband is from that area. Actually, he was born in Shedlitz.
Okay.
Yeah. And he spent a lot of time researching and talking about this area, actually. So
Great.
he has a comment with the
Okay, great.
Hi. Would anyone give a comment?
Me? No,
No,
please.
would everybody mind?
Jump right in.
So, because I was just thinking, I was picking up on what Tanya was saying, but also what, I mean, you and I were talking this earlier, having spent I know more about Treblinka than a human being should know, as you do, right? And so one of the things that I always think after I read these things, and I guess what I want to say, having listened to that really difficult but helpful overview of that, is like, what is the way forward, right? Because I just feel like there has to be like some takeaway from like how, we already know that the never again is a false promise, right? Like we've already had Syria, we've had Yugoslavia, I'm old enough to remember Yugoslavia existing, I'm old enough to have been to Yugoslavia. And so, when I think about this topic for myself personally, and I don't know how any of you think about this, for me there's a couple of takeaways, right? One of them is I noticed you had a quote from Tim Snyder's book, Bloodlines. There's a book that I would recommend, which I think has such urgency, which is Tim Snyder's other book called Dark Earth. And the argument that he makes, and it's, I think, so urgent because he talks about Hitler, Black Earth, I'm sorry, not Dark, Black Earth. He talks about Hitler, Black Earth.
Black
by
Earth, Timothy Snyder.
And he talks about because I think one of the things that like all of us are, the other crisis that's going to lead to displacement and refugees, right, is the coming climate or the, current climate crisis. But one of the things that's really interesting when he talks about is Hitler as a kind of environmentalist, right? And the ways in which environmental language can both be mobilized for progressive purposes and also the ways in which there's just this potential dark side. There's a potential, for fascism in environmental language. Because one of the things that I'm just aware of in this present moment is that we talk about a coming environmental crisis, being really conscious of thinking about the history of environmentalism as also a narrative with a certain kind of political history, right? Just like Arena's Semler's story can be a story of the left or the right, and it's not even to polarize left and right, but it can be, it can be that, right? But environmentalism also, and climate crisis, because Snyder does this amazing job of talking about the ways in which Hitler is talking about that. The other thing I think is just brilliant about Snyder's book is he talks about why did genocide happen in Poland and not in Germany, right? And he says that he goes through and he looks at where genocides have happened and why genocides appear. Like, why does some places go to war and genocide doesn't happen and other places have a war and genocide does? And he says what appears to him to be the case, and I think it's really persuasive, is that genocide occurs in places where the institutions of the state have been dismantled, right? And he talks about in how 1939, Hitler deliberately goes in to dismantle the Polish state, right? Because part of what he wants to do is destroy Poland, right, as a national concept. So he goes and he systematically first dismantles the institutions of the state. And Snyder
arrests all the priests.
Right, exactly, and the intelligentsia, and all of the, in all sorts of ways, the law, and hospitals. I mean, just all of the kind of institutions of the state are dismantled systematically. And so one of the things that I'm also, always thinking, I guess, in this moment for myself is, like, in terms of our own activism, what if the most important thing to defend is the institutions of the state, right? Like, what if defending the institutions of the state is the front line of activism, right? Because that is the thing that lies between us and the potential for genocide. I mean, this all assumes that we accept that Snyder's argument is the correct one, right? But personally, I find it really, really persuasive, right? So there's that, and then the other thing I'm thinking about is, this issue of, like, how is it you undo the legacy of genocide? Because the other problem is that, genocide tends to be, and I mean, I'm sure, I'm not sure you can speak to this, more intimately, but one of the things I know is having gone and interviewed Holocaust survivors, right? Like, I have sat in a room with elderly people and asked them to tell me again the story of the murder of their families, right? And one of the things that, I think I've said this to you before, right? I remember, like, you go into that as a historian, and what you think is, you don't have the right to cry, right? Because you don't have the right to do anything that makes it harder for this person to tell that story. And we spent a whole summer, my husband and I, and like, under the table, I remember pinching my leg as hard as I could, because if I could focus on the physical pain of, like, the hurt in my leg, I could control not breaking down in tears while I was hearing somebody's story. But, so, for me, like, I mean, one of the things that I take away from that is, for myself, the witnessing of the story, and like some remove, right, is the history of a kind of trauma that gets written into the body, right? And all of the psychological studies about trauma, especially trauma having to do with genocide, is the ways in which trauma is both intergenerational and also gets written on the body, right? And like, I mean, obviously we have on the one hand this unfolding kind of situation in the United States, Canada, also Europe. I mean, there was a really important article, I think, in The Guardian about European outsourcing of its refugee problem at the moment, right? So, we're all in that position, and then I always think as a Canadian, right? I mean, as I said, I'm saying speaking both as an American and as a Canadian, right? I'm in that weird space of speaking in both those ways. I think about, as Canadians, our problem with the residential schools, and about, our own struggle, like the thing that we struggle, it's the French struggle to talk about Vichy France, right? In Canada, we struggle, especially in the West, to talk about the First Nations problem, right? And the history of what it means to be both a colony and post-colonial, right? Like how do we untangle that? But I think maybe one of the other things to think about is the ways in which, like, unless the doctors and the nurses and the psychologists and the institutions of the state can help unwrite on the bodies, right, some of that trauma, I don't know that culturally, you can inoculate yourself against the repetition of the violence of genocide. Because the problem is that genocide has this intense afterlife, right? And I think that's part of what we're dealing with the residential schools. This is just this echo chamber.
I'm